Good evening, everybody. Buonasera. And thank you for being here in such good numbers, which is a sign of the interest that the academic world and the ecumenical world have in the themes that are being presented as we commemorate Cardinal Bea, as we honor his memory. I think that it's clear when most people think of Cardinal Bea, perhaps the first thing that comes to their mind is Nostra Aetate. But we cannot really honor him if we don't also say something about his ecumenical charism vocation. And that's what we will do this evening. We have 4 magnificent presenters. Our evening is divided more or less into 2 parts, in the sense that first we will hear directly about the figure of Cardinal Bea as an ecumenist, as somebody who influenced the conversion of the Catholic Church to the ecumenical movement. And then in the second part, we will enter into the theme of the Petrine ministry, which is always a sensitive and difficult theme in ecumenical relations. So I will present the speakers briefly as they come to speak. I would like to just say one thing. I was a student here almost at the time of the Second Vatican Council. And I often think we studied on a manual that was very famous. Felice Capello had a manual which we all had to study about canonical and sacramental questions. And in 1961, the Gregorian published the 10th or 20th edition of the manual. And nobody noticed except the poor students who had to buy it and study. But it's interesting, because most of the bishops who came to the council in 1962 had studied in such a manual, or they had something similar. So why am I interested in it? Because if you look at it, and when he talks about relations, sacramental relations with non-Catholic Christians, that he called heretics and schismatics in the language of the day, he said, absolutely impossible. And then he gives the reason. He says, they are simply outside the church. Most of the bishops who came to the council had studied such books. They had that same Catholic exclusivism. In 3 years, the vast majority of them signed on to Unitatis Redintegratio. And that little miracle, I think, has to be attributed in particular to Cardinal Bea. So we're talking about somebody who had a huge influence on the council and therefore on the Catholic Church in bringing us to a conversion to ecumenism. I'm happy to introduce Metropolitan Maximos. We have known each other since I started working at the Pontifical Council. He was a young deacon then he became the archdeacon, now he's a metropolitan. And Metropolitan Maximos received a doctorate in theology from the University of London on a theme that is rather unusual in Orthodox, in the Orthodox world, primacy in the Church, from Vatican I to Vatican II, an Orthodox perspective. So no better man to present to us an Orthodox response to the whole question of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. Please.
Thank you, Father. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Father Etienne Veto, Director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies, for inviting me to offer some humble reflections on the difficult subject of papal primacy. In the past, Papal primacy was considered, certainly not always, as the main point of division between Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. Papal primacy has always been a central issue in ecumenical discussions as well, as it is evident from the well-known papal encyclical Utunum Sint and the many theological responses to this encyclical. Ultimately, all Christians, including Orthodox, Anglicans, and Lutherans alike, engage in inter-Christian dialogue and admit the necessity for a universal ministry of unity, which could be exercised by the Bishop of Rome. Vatican II also contributed to this ecumenical spirit quite substantially. The question that remains, however, is what kind of universal ministry, of universal primacy, would be acceptable? The answer to this is certainly not a primacy of direct jurisdiction over the whole Church, as was defined by Vatican I. All non-Roman Catholic Christians agree on this point. There is no doubt about that. Therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to clarify some important points regarding the important issue of Petrine ministry from an Orthodox perspective. First, the immediate Orthodox reactions to Vatican I were polemical, and these reactions have proven over time to lack discernment and coherence. Unfortunately, this polemical line of thought still maintains popularity in the Orthodox Christian world, and even in the recent past, some Orthodox representatives in the theological dialogue between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches chose to take this polemical stance on the issue of papal primacy. Certainly, the overall concept of primacy needs to be discussed from a theological point of view, as the Ravenna document clearly demonstrates. And the Eucharistic ecclesiology of communion that was experienced by both East and West in the first millennium is the key for articulating a sound theology of primacy. The ecclesiology of communion should be the guiding principle for addressing the present issues of our dialogue, primacy and synodality in the second millennium and today, as it was the case recently with the Chieti document, which focused on the issue of primacy and synodality in the first millennium. As we have seen, discussions strictly focused on a historical perspective are not enough, and sometimes can create great difficulties in discussing papal primacy, particularly in the period of the second millennium. Metropolitan John Zizioulas has been explicit about this very subject. As most of you well know, Metropolitan John was the former co-president of the dialogue between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. Some of you may not know, however, that he views the historical method to be categorically unrealistic. Within the perspective of the ecclesiology of communion, the Ravenna document states that primacy at all different levels must always be considered within the context of conciliarity, and that conciliarity must always be considered within the context of primacy. With such an ecclesiology, that is, with an ecclesiology of communion, the primate carries the charisma of expressing the communion of the local churches and searches for ways to achieve unanimity and harmony. Primacy is at the service of the ecclesial communion, and it is therefore understood as diaconia and not as a power over the church. The convocation of the Holy Grain Council of the Orthodox Church by the primate of the Orthodox Church was an example of how primacy should be exercised within a synodical context. Both synodality and primacy should express the communion of the local churches. The Orthodox Church is not a co-federation of autocephalous churches united spiritually in the same faith, sacraments, and administrative system, as has been recently stated. Conceptually, this represents a very Protestant idea, but it has been regularly invoked by a particular Orthodox polemical theology that targets the papal primacy of jurisdiction. The unity of the Orthodox Church on the universal level is visibly achieved through the institutions of the synods and through a universal ministry of primacy. That is, through the ecumenical patriarch, the head of the whole Orthodox Church. Second, in a unified church, the Bishop of Rome, as the occupant of the first see or throne, will be a primus on the universal level. His primacy will not be of direct jurisdiction over the whole church or of a simple honor. It canonically involves and implies certain rights and authority. For example, such prerogatives are the presidency over and the convocation of an ecumenical council, and the indispensability of the primate's presence in the synodical activities, personally or through representatives, as well as the right of appeal. The term primacy of honor implies such prerogatives, and it cannot simply be used in honorific terms. Also, the term primus inter pares rightly emphasizes the equality of the primate and his fellow bishops, but this term is usually associated with the notion of a simply honorific primacy. I wrote elsewhere that employing primus inter paribus attempts to describe the unique role of the primate in relation to his fellow bishops and could create misunderstandings as well, since it gives the impression that the primate is superior over the other bishops. According to Orthodox ecclesiology, all the bishops are equal, and no one could be elevated above all the other bishops. One of them, however, has a unique ministry within the episcopal body. It is the ministry of the primate that has a unique charisma or ministry of unity within the church. The canons of the church offer the most suitable and appropriate term concerning the ministry of the primate, the term protos. In order to dispel any misunderstandings regarding the unique position and role of the primate, the best term is protos. When we examine the term primacy and synodality in the first millennium, through our dialogue, we were confronted with a question: does universal primacy exist in the church iure divino or iure humano? In the past, for polemical reasons, both the Protestants and the Orthodox asserted contrarily that primacy exists iure humano, that is, by human convention and not by divine right. Metropolitan John Zizioulas points to the logical contradiction of this argumentation by indicating that if primacy is an essential element of synodality, then it must therefore exist by divine order. In the recent past, I was criticized for adopting a theological justification of primacy on the grounds that such a justification is not founded on the patristic and canonical tradition of the Church. At first glance, this could easily seem plausible. However, a more careful look will show that this is rather misleading. It is widely recognized today that a systematic definition of the Church did not exist in the past in antiquity. Without a systematic definition of the Church, though, as Zizioulas has noted, a systematic theology of primacy is not possible. In the 20th century, which has been commonly referred to as the century of ecclesiology, we do see the emergence of the systematic doctrine of the Church, along with the systematic doctrine of primacy. Also, it is worth mentioning that in the Chieti document, primacy is also seen in theological terms, mainly from a Christological point of view. On the other hand, there are voices like my own that advocate a triadological foundation of primacy. On the other hand, though, there are also theologians who reject any triodological basis for primacy, or those who are reluctant to accept it, and instead develop a theology of primacy from a Eucharistic point of view. Similarly, Emeritus Pope Benedict links the ministry of papal primacy to the Eucharistic nature of the Church. If our ecclesiological model is a Trinitarian one, see the Munich document, this also implies a kind of hierarchy, unless we consider the unity in the Holy Trinity in terms of triunity, replacing the one God the Father of the Bible with the unity of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. According to the Cappadocian Fathers, this ordering is also referred to as the immanent Trinity, and not only the economic Trinity, as some Orthodox theologians argue. There is then an asymmetry in God's Trinitarian existence, and any symmetrical understanding of the relation between the person of the Holy Trinity would put faith in God, the Father, at risk. In the Church, a hierarchical order has always existed. In the Bible, we see this with Peter, who was first among the apostles. We also see this with James and the Church of Jerusalem, and later on with the Church of Rome. We cannot simply ignore this common element of our tradition. We cannot attribute hierarchical ecclesiology and primacy to Neoplatonic influences, ignoring any connection to the divine aspect of the Church. Overall, theological dialogue has helped the two churches come closer together, closer than they have been in centuries, especially concerning their understanding of primacy as the universal ministry of maintaining communion in the Church. And this is a significant development. The recent papal statements that a greater synodality should be implemented within the Catholic Church, and that Catholics have much to learn from their Orthodox brothers and sisters in this regard, could be considered as very significant and hopeful steps towards the realization of the unity between the two churches. Thank you.
Metropolitan Maximus, many thanks. You have presented us with much food for thought, drawing out the implications of different approaches between Catholics and Orthodox in the dialogue towards the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion, the possible communion of the churches. Historically, I remember as a student, most of the underpinning of the explanation of the role of the Bishop of Rome, of the primacy of the Pope, was based on historical situations. We learned when he intervened and what he did and the power that he had to do so. We realize now in our ecumenical dialogue that such a path is incomplete and will never lead us to the final goal. We understand that the theological underpinnings of primacy are essential, but I also think that you will agree with me that we still have much work to do in our dialogue to develop a true theology of primacy. And as you pointed out towards the end there, that this primacy cannot in any way be separated from the synodality that binds all, including the primate, together as the source of the communion of the various churches. So, thank you, Metropolitan. Thank you for this insight. And I'm sure that in the future, please God, we will have a chance to continue this discussion.